Joseph lived to be 110 years old and died. The Egyptians held a grand funeral for him. His body was placed in a coffin, waiting for the Israelites to take him back to Canaan when they left Egypt in the future. The Israelites were blessed by God in Egypt, and their numbers grew rapidly and became very powerful. However, when the new Pharaoh came to the throne, he was afraid of the growing number of Israelites and worried that they might unite with the enemy to rebel against Egypt in the future. So Pharaoh began to oppress the Israelites, forcing them to do hard labor and build cities and warehouses. However, the number of Israelites continued to increase, making Pharaoh even more uneasy. In the end, Pharaoh issued a cruel order, requiring all Egyptian midwives to drown the male babies born to the Israelites in the Nile River and only allow female babies to survive. In such an environment, Moses' mother gave birth to Moses in secret to avoid Pharaoh's order. Moses was the leader prepared by God for the Israelites and an important beginning of God's salvation plan. Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, but then she couldn't hide him anymore. So she made a basket out of reeds, put Moses in it, and floated down the Nile. Moses' sister Miriam followed the basket quietly, observing the movements. Finally, Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter. She pitied the child and decided to adopt him, even though she knew Moses was an Israelite. Miriam tactfully suggested that Pharaoh's daughter find an Israelite woman to breastfeed Moses, so that Moses' biological mother could enter the palace to take care of him until he grew up. More than 10 years later, Moses, who had grown up, saw an Egyptian abusing an Israelite slave on the street, and Moses killed the Egyptian in anger. Pharaoh learned about this, and Moses had to flee Egypt and seek refuge in Midian. In Midian, Moses met the priest Jethro and married his daughter Zipporah, and Moses lived a peaceful shepherding life. Many years later, when Moses was shepherding sheep on Mount Horeb, he saw a thorn bush burning but not being burned. As he approached and observed, he saw God calling him the bush, appointing him as the savior of the Israelites. God said to Moses, "I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt and have heard their cries. I will save them from the hands of the Egyptians." Moses was afraid and unsure at first, but God promised to be with him. God gave Moses, and Moses threw his staff on the ground, which immediately turned into a snake. When Moses took out his hand, his palm was covered with leprosy, proving God's power through miracles. Moses finally accepted the mission and began to fight against Pharaoh. Moses returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron and asked Pharaoh to release the Israelites. But Pharaoh refused and increased the labor burden of the Israelites, making their lives more difficult. God sent down 10 plagues to punish Pharaoh. 1. Water turned to blood. The water of the Nile River turned to blood. All the fish died, and the water became undrinkable. 2. Frogs. Large numbers of frogs emerged from the river and filled the homes of the Egyptians. 3. Lice. Dust turned into lice and attacked people and livestock. 4. Flies. Large numbers of flies infested all of Egypt, except for the areas where the Israelites lived. 5. Livestock plague. Egyptian livestock contracted the plague and died, but the Israelites' livestock were safe. 6. Boils. The Egyptians and their livestock were covered with painful boils. 7. Hail. Huge hailstones fell from the sky, destroying Egypt's crops and houses. 8. Locusts. Swarms of locusts devoured all of Egypt's plants and crops. 9. Darkness. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, and there was light only where the Israelites lived. 10. Death of the firstborn. This was the worst disaster, and all of Egypt's firstborn sons, including Pharaoh's, died on this night. In order to protect the Israelites from the 10th plague, death of the firstborn, God asked each Israelite family to slaughter a flawless lamb and smear the lamb's blood on the doorframe and lintel to form a sign. When the angel of death descended on Egypt, he would see the blood on the doorframe and pass over the family and not harm the firstborn inside. This became the origin of Passover, one of the most important festivals of the Israelite nation. After Pharaoh's firstborn son was killed, Pharaoh finally agreed to let Moses and Aaron lead the Israelites out of Egypt, which marked the Israelites' escape from Egypt and the end of their slave life in Egypt. But just as the Israelites left Egypt, Pharaoh regretted it and sent his army to pursue the Israelites. The pursued Israelites came to the Red Sea, where they were blocked by the sea in front of them, and the Egyptian pursuers behind them were getting closer and closer. The Israelites fell into extreme fear, but Moses still believed in God's power, and God asked Moses to raise his staff. The water of the Red Sea was miraculously divided, forming high walls on both sides. The Israelites walked on dry land and crossed the Red Sea safely. The Egyptian pursuers followed closely behind, but when they entered the Red Sea, the seawater closed again, and all the Egyptian pursuers were drowned and destroyed. This miracle not only saved the Israelites, but also allowed them to witness the great power of God and strengthen their faith. The Israelites began their journey in the Sinai wilderness. After experiencing difficult tests such as hunger and thirst, they also began to complain about Moses and God. Sometimes they even longed to return to Egypt, thinking that although they were slaves in Egypt, at least they had food to eat. God still showed his mercy and love, sending food from heaven to the Israelites and giving them water from the rock to help them survive the crisis. On Mount Sinai, God issued the 10 Commandments to Moses, which included basic moral principles such as worshiping the only God, prohibiting idolatry, respecting parents, not killing, not stealing, and not bearing false witness. These were important contents of the covenant between God and the Israelites, and were also the legal basis for the life of the Israelites. Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, receiving and engraving God's law on stone tablets. However, when Moses came down the mountain, he found that the Israelites had turned away from God again during his absence, and they had cast a golden calf as an idol for worship. Moses was very angry. He smashed the stone tablets and executed these worshippers. Moses then climbed the mountain again and asked God for forgiveness, and God finally gave him new stone tablets. Because the Israelites had repeatedly shown disbelief and rebellion against God, God decided to punish them and let the Israelites wander in the wilderness for another 40 years until all the unbelievers in God died naturally. Only their descendants were allowed to enter the land of Canaan. Once, the Israelites began to complain about the lack of water again, and Moses asked God. God commanded Moses to speak to a rock and let water flow out. Moses was angry at the Israelites' constant complaints and lack of faith, so he did not speak to the rock as God commanded, but struck the rock twice with his rod. This behavior not only violated God's instructions, but also failed to fully honor and manifest God's glory. So he was rebuked by God, and God did not allow Moses to lead the Israelites into the promised land. In a blink of an eye, 40 years passed, and in the final stage of the wandering in the wilderness, God instructed Moses to appoint his assistant Joshua as the new leader of the Israelites. After Moses died at the age of 120, Joshua took over the leadership and led the Israelites into the land of Canaan. This marked the end of the Israelites' 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and the beginning of entering the land promised by God.